And welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and prior to his academic career, Dr. Kenneth Barnes spent many years as a senior international executive for multiple multi-billion-dollar companies doing business on 6 continents. He's also served as a bivocational pastor in both the United States and the UK, where he holds dual citizenship. Currently, the Mockler Phillips Chair at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and tutor of theology and religious studies at Oxford, Dr. Barnes is married to Debbie, a singer-songwriter and professional voiceover artist. They have 3 grown children, Bernadette, Kristen, and Julia. Dr. Barnes joins us today to talk about his new book, Redeeming Capitalism, and right at the very top it says, "In God We Trust." Dr. Kenneth Barnes, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Barnes, what in your background was really the launch pad for you to go truly bivocationally to be a business tycoon and a minister of the gospel?
Well, that's a good question. It wasn't by design. Frankly, there's an old expression, as I'm sure you've heard, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Yes.
And so I was somewhat a good example of that. I originally started right out of university in business, really, and I just happened to be good at it. But in some ways, I was fairly typical of my generation, you know, vice president at 25 and the annoying suspenders and the yellow tie. And I felt there was something missing in my life. And I was raised as a Christian. I was practicing as a Christian with my wife and family, and felt as though God was actually calling me to ministry. But I didn't really know what ministry meant. So I started to study theology. In fact, I was a student at Gordon Conwell 35 years ago. So my intention originally was to leave behind the corporate world and be a quote-unquote pastor somewhere. But God just had different plans. And I ended up spending the next 30 years combining my life as a pastor, bivocationally, with my really very wonderful corporate career and my life as an academic. So I kind of had 3 collars for 30 years. And then it was just before the global financial crisis that I left the corporate world and really concentrated on the academic side. And then the global financial crisis happened, and hence the book.
The word capitalism today, in light of, and especially in American politics, American society, and even in looking at other economic dynamics within other nations and the global economy, capitalism seems to be almost in some worlds completely negative, completely demonized, and yet there's not a nation in the world that is not operating, whether or not they call themselves socialistic, communistic, or whatever the other categories might be. They still have an economy of supply and demand. They still have an economy which is driven by utilizing resources, buying, selling, manufacturing, and the trigger to all of that goes back to a philosophy that I know you heard in business, that nothing in the world's economy happens until somebody sells something. Mm-hmm. And that's the trigger point, is that I've sold it, now we have to compile the goods and products and services. How is capitalism truly defined in the world today, and is there a universal definition of what capitalism is?
Well, that's a great question. And I actually start the book by saying that capitalism is a subject, not an object. And this is part of the problem. People treat capitalism as though it possessed a hypostasis, as though it were an entity with mind behind it, with will behind it. I've heard expressions like the money-hungry market and all those things. Well, that's simply a misunderstanding of what capitalism is. Capitalism is nothing more than the word we use to describe the phenomenon of free market exchange, which is highly monetized and lightly regulated. That's all capitalism is. It is not an artificial construct like socialism or Marxism or any of the other utopian alternatives. I have a whole chapter on utopian alternatives. I have a whole chapter on Marxism. It is an evolutionary phenomenon. It came out of centuries of exchange. So while capitalism hasn't always existed in the way we understand it since the dawn of, say, fractional banking in the 18th century, exchange has always existed. There have always been the markets in the Old Testament. There's always been the opportunity for people to exchange goods and services. However, the more monetized those systems became, the more they resembled what we would call capitalism today. So during the Roman Empire, for instance, there was what you might even call a proto-capitalism because there was a universally accepted code of conduct, rules of exchange, and a currency which had the imprimatur of the emperor. So these things have been around for a very long time.
If we look in terms like capitalism, socialism, Marxism, would God's economy in the Bible not be the framework for capitalism as we know it today?
Well, I'm always careful to go that far. What I would say is there are certainly biblical principles that would make a very strong case for a free market economy. However, the problem with capitalism as it's practiced today, and this is important, is that it has been subject to sin like the rest of creation, and therefore the capitalism we have isn't necessarily the capitalism we want. So if we want a capitalism that reflects the values and the virtues that we hold dear as followers of Christ and biblical believers, then we are going to have to address the sin at the core of it. So I tell everyone the title of the book is Redeeming Capitalism, not Replacing Capitalism.
Right. I tend to go back to the Old Testament to look at the transaction that took place between Abraham as he was negotiating for the cave at Machpelah, where they were going to give it to him. And he said, no, it has value, and I want to make sure that it remains, I have title to it for eternity, and therefore I'm going to pay you the fair market value. I then look at King David as he goes to Ornan the Jebusite, and he purchases the threshing floor so that the deed is recorded, and he gives him a value, and there is a transaction made, and the transaction's recorded in the Bible, so that even today, as people are contesting who owns Mount Moriah, I can go back to a deed in the Bible, giving the transaction, notifying me of the date, time, and place, and that a transaction took place between the actual owner of that piece of property who transferred title to David for the building of the temple. I see those as a transactional economy, someone setting a value and someone paying that value. We looked at women as chattel in the Bible, which was a commodity. This would be in the commodities brokering category of the free market economy as they negotiated the price for the bride. Would it be 4 camels, 12 goats, 8 sheep, and X amount of silver and gold? That too was also a market-driven free economy based on the bride, her age, her ability to bear children, many of the factors that went into the value of it. And I would find that in compliance with what we would define as capitalism today. It was not the equal distribution of wealth. So how did we get so far afield from the pure concept of free market economy, owner having the right to establish whatever value he chooses, puts it out there for that value, a negotiation takes place, and a new value is established, which is what is agreed upon by two parties, and that is the essence of capitalism, is it not?
Well, it's certainly one of the building blocks of capitalism, absolutely. There's a few reasons why these things go astray. One problem is that in the capitalism we often see exercised today is that it's purely transactional. And in biblical accounts, it's transactions within the context of relational. And we are losing the relational. As I say in the book, one of the problems even with the nature of work is that it has become contractual instead of covenantal. We've lost this sense of mutual accountability. And in a sense, in biblical jargon, we really don't see pure ownership as much as the establishment of stewardship within perpetuity, titled stewardship. It all belongs to God. So we have a constant tension between private ownership and wealth, which is absolutely supported in the Bible, and the requirement to look after the common good. And so this constant tension requires balance. And we occasionally go out of balance in both directions. There are times when we go out of balance where we aren't being sufficient or good stewards, and we aren't concerned about the common good, love of neighbor, etc. And there are other times where we go so far in that direction that we lose the notion of personal responsibility, individual ownership, creation of wealth. And as I tell my socialist friends, and I have many socialist friends, as I'm sure you do, you can't distribute that which you haven't created. And one of the problems with definitions of wealth is that the definition of wealth, unlike what Marx believed, for instance, that it is the accumulative value of all commodities, wealth is actually nothing more than the delta between the amount of labor and resource necessary for subsistence and everything else. So wealth, unlike matter, can be both created and or destroyed. So we need to have an economic system which allows human beings to create wealth, which I actually believe goes right back to the original fiat of creation, that we are to go and to multiply and to create as subsidiaries of God's creation fiat. This cultural mandate is very important to what it means to be human. However, within the context of that, we also have to make sure that we are providing an environment that is just. We are acting with prudence, that there is temperance in what we do, not excessive extravagance, etc., that we are exercising these virtues, that faith and hope and love are at the core of our economic activity. And what has happened is, unfortunately, as a culture, we have in many ways lost those virtues and succumbed to a kind of ethical egoism that pretends if everybody only looks after themselves, all will be well, when in fact we must look after neighbor as well. So instead of this dichotomy, we need to have a harmony between these concepts. I think that is truly the biblical model, is to have harmony between the two. And we've lost that harmony, and that's why we are up against the wall.
It's interesting that you build the case for social responsibility of the capitalist, if you will. I earn what I earn in, let's say, a corporate environment, and then from that I am, I believe, commanded by God to tithe to the local storehouse and to give offerings to various ministries in support of the work of God and to help those who are in need. Jesus said, give to the one who asks. If you have a ministry that's orphanages, homeless, shelters, those kind of things, that is your ask. By your very existence is your ask. So I believe in that being where a part of my distribution of my wealth should go. But in the capitalistic environment, I get to choose who is the beneficiary, the same way I do with my estate, the same way God does with his estate. And he has given a covenant relationship with Israel, the land, to the Jews and those engrafted in to that, because he's a living God, and as a father he can bequeath to whoever he wants, whatever he wants. He's not dead. So we see that there's this ideal built into the Bible that says that the owner should, one, responsibly distribute. Malachi talks about bringing the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there might be food in my house. The book of Ruth talks about not leaving the gleanings so that those who are in need have a place. And so God sets it up where the responsible capitalist, the socially minded capitalist, can build his wealth and then choose its distribution, where the socialistic model is that everything goes into a common pile and is equally distributed regardless of your contribution to society. Therefore, it takes the greatest, highest producer and the lowest producer and equalizes them, kind of like the kibbutz model was and still is in some places in Israel, that you could be the general manager and you could be the gardener and you would share equally in and be paid the same amount of money because you're provided with living on the property, food on the property, and you share equally. Or then there's the Moshav model, which is more capitalistic. You don't have to live there and you're paid based on your contribution and your level of expertise. Can they coexist? Is there a way for one to theoretically be a subset or the application of the other? And are we demonizing capitalism by creating a socialistic counterpart to it as opposed to weaving them together in a responsible redemption of capitalism and bringing real relevance to the distribution of wealth?
The answer is yes. They can coexist, but we need to be careful we don't demonize the other side either. There is a role for the state. There is a role for the collective. And this is part of the problem with the current dialogue. Very often people want to talk in extremes. And they often will convolute, by the way, totalitarian Marxism and socialism, and that's really not fair. They are different models completely. In most instances where socialism has had some success, it has been democratic socialism, where people in liberal democracies such as ours, the UK, Germany, etc., have, through the ballot box, chosen to expand the areas of the economy where the collective is more active than the market. Because there are some things the collective does very well, maybe better than the market. But you and I would certainly agree that in most instances, and certainly in commercial areas, the markets left relatively alone do better than the collective. So it's a question of balance. How do we let the markets do what markets are designed to do and in order to create wealth for human flourishing? And then how do we agree on those areas where actually there are limitations to the markets? Because markets aren't perfect. We know that they aren't perfect. We have situations, for instance, in Vancouver right now, where the real estate market is completely out of sorts because there's an artificial influx of money coming from China, inflating prices in the real estate market so that local people can no longer live in their own communities. Well, that's an area where there's a role for the state to come in and intervene so that that distortion of the market doesn't ruin the community. So there are places where there's a role for the state to get involved. So this demonization is very, very dangerous because if we allow those who would see most things done in the collective, let's call them sort of pure socialists, utopian socialists, to have their way, we will kill wealth creation. If we ignore the fact that there is a place for the state, then we will end up with more and more excess and more inequality and more of the abuses and the things that have caused a lot of the anti-capitalist sentiment. We have to be honest. We are sinners. We have sinned. Capitalism has participated in that sin. And in the book, I talk a lot about the global financial crisis and the moral collapse that led to it, and the LIBOR scandal, and some other things that we have to accept are part of the system. So how do we who love this system, who want this system to continue to create the wealth it has, introduce virtue in a way that will more reflect God's intention for wealth creation than man's intention for wealth creation?
We're talking with Dr. Kenneth J. Barnes, author of the newly released book, Redeeming Capitalism, almost debunking the myth that Jesus was a socialist. It builds a very good case for what you call a liberty-oriented economy that allows for capitalism to be a source of social redemption and social change if we would just act like the Bible instructed us to act. And that becomes the conundrum. Can we actually conform and adhere to who Jesus calls us to be? And that is to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Would we need the United Way? Would we need all these charities if we actually, as the body, were doing our part in making sure that this world and those who are hungry, those who are impoverished, those who are in need were actually taken care of by the local community? Would we need these high-paid executives, $600,000, $1.5 million, $5 million to run a charity for distribution and have them be better at distributing our wealth than we ourselves should be doing as stewards as what God has called us to do? Interesting topics, worthy of great debate, but we have to go to break right now. When we come back, we're going to continue in this conversation with Dr. Kenneth Barnes, author of Redeeming Capitalism. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Dr. Kenneth Barnes, author of Redeeming Capitalism, an incredible study on how to redeem, not replace, but redeem capitalism from a faith-based perspective. Dr. Barnes, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Ken, in the book, you build a case for what you call liberty-oriented economy, which, to summarize for our audience, is I have a personal responsibility to captain my economic ship and distribute my wealth. And as a believer, the Bible gives me a rule and guide for how I might do that. And if, in your premise, if every Bible-believing or even self-professed or self-defined Christian applied the biblical principles, then we would shift the wealth of the nation and raise the entire level of the water so that all the boats rise together without having to have a mandated socialism as the way of wealth distribution. Is that a correct summary?
Yes, basically what I say is that we defer to legislation and regulation when ethics fail. So we need to ensure that ethics don't fail. And at the root of ethics is morality, and at the root of morality is religious belief. You know, in the book, I trace several epics of capitalism. I talk about the traditional capitalism that Adam Smith observed in the 18th century. And that capitalism had a moral basis based on what you might call an Enlightenment interpretation of Judeo-Christian belief. But it was a very strong cultural mandate to act in certain ways, to act in virtuous ways, in ways that were consistent with the Ten Commandments and with the double love command, with the golden rule. These things were just not negotiable. If you look at the capitalism that we saw 120 or so years after that, during the so-called Protestant work ethic period observed by Max Weber, it was an even more specific Christian cultural understanding of capitalism. And this Protestant ethic was based on an all-encompassing, this worldly asceticism, this whole life discipleship approach to economic activity which said if individuals make their work their worship, if they are thrifty with their handling of money, if they reinvest in business instead of spend the wealth they create purely on selfish means and personal aggrandizement and pleasure, but then share that wealth with community, with employees, to create new businesses, to expand the liquidity, you will get capitalism on steroids, and that's exactly what we got. But Max Weber made a very serious warning in his work when he said, if American capitalism ever loses this tether to this very specific Christian ethic, within 2 or 3 generations, you could have a very different kind of capitalism. You could have a capitalism which is, and this is my definition, is postmodern. It's devoid of a moral compass and resistant, if not impervious, to ethical constraint. And that's what has created the excesses that has caused people to question capitalism itself. Because the excesses are real and they are serious, but the good news is we can change it. Because capitalism is a subject and not an object, if the capitalism we have is not the capitalism we want, we can make it the capitalism we want. We can turn it into a virtuous economic system. And that's the purpose of the book.
So what would the steps be to, you've got this big ship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have the ship of debt. We have the ship of overspending. We have the ship of self-indulgence. We have the ship of pride and narcissistic, a narcissistic economic system where it's all about me, and mine. And then we have the system of comparison, which, how do I measure up against this metric, or how do I measure up? You know, I'm almost 67 years old. I look and the retirement charts, and I'll never retire. I'll never have enough money to retire, but there's no biblical retirement anyways. Why would I? What would I retire to do? To be a talk show host? Well, okay, then I'm retired because that's what I do. How do we? And there have to be small changes, radical changes, as the Bernie Sanders, as the new vocal left are talking about mandates for free this and free that and free this and free that and give everything away with no understanding whatsoever about where the money is going to come from, to a free world economy, which has no tariffs, no trade restraints, covering everything from medical to manufacturing, which is ideal in a free market economy, that everything would be free market. With that, then propagate a monopolistic. We saw the monopoly. I worked for the monopoly, AT&T. They broke us up, and now we're back together again, bigger than we ever were and they ever could conceive of at that time, now running the cable television business. And okay, you took the lid off, now we can become a monopoly even bigger than what you thought we were. How do we make, what moves do we make? And where is the responsibility for making those moves? Where does it all begin?
Great question. The first thing I remind people, and it's the last thing I say in the book, is that this book is not a manifesto for a movement. It is a credo for a community that believes we can do better by following God's precepts. That's the first thing. So that means it starts with an acceptance that there is no magic bullet. The utopian responses are doomed to failure. If for no other reason than the global economy has become so complex that we simply aren't clever enough to construct an economic utopian solution. But that doesn't mean we can't start the process of redemption first by changing the narrative. And that begins by accepting the fact that there are two ways to approach it. One is from the bottom up, and the other is from the top down. When we start from the bottom up, we're talking about something that anybody, that everybody can be involved in. Not everybody can be involved from the top down. Not everyone has that level of influence. But everyone can start by changing the narrative about things like work. You know, our theology of work should be foundational to our theology of economics. But work has become something that people don't value anymore. They don't realize that to be created in the image of God, who is the worker par excellence, we are created in his image. That means that there's more than just a telos to work, but there is both a deontology, a duty to work, and there is an ontology. It is something about what it means to be a human being created in God's image to work. So we need to reclaim the dignity of work, the beauty of work in all of its forms. Regardless of its monetary impact, it still has an economic impact. And that means unpaid work, for instance. I have a friend at Oxford who's doing research, and she's trying to quantify what the economic benefit is of all of the unpaid work that women do traditionally in society. Caring professions, housewife work, home economics, as we used to call it. Because without that work, our economy would come to a screeching halt. So we need to start by re-energizing a positive theology of work. The other thing we need to do is we need to take a hard look at money. You mentioned debt. This is one of my greatest concerns in the book. You know, money is not the same thing as wealth, and people confuse the two. Money is, first of all, nothing more than a means of exchange. And secondly, it's supposed to be a representation of wealth, meaning that it is tied to that delta between the amount of labor and resource necessary for subsistence and everything else. When we went off the gold standard in 1971, that was the right thing to do economically for a lot of reasons, but there was a presumption of prudence behind that decision. No one could have imagined that we would have built up a $21 trillion national debt during peacetime. After the global financial crisis, we increased our national debt by $10 trillion and added $4.5 trillion in quantitative easing, which is built on debt instruments. So we now have a national debt which is 104% of our GDP. In peacetime, that's unprecedented. That is going to come home to roost at some point, and we need to accept that and understand it. So here's the analogy I give. As a business person, you'll understand this. Our GDP in those 10 years grew $4 trillion. Can you imagine if the CEO of a company said to the shareholders, in the last 10 years, I've increased our P&L account by $4 billion, but I took $14 billion off the balance sheet to do it. That's what we've done as America, Inc. So we need to start to bring thrift and prudence back into our economic modeling, starting with the personal level, but in our communities, and ultimately at the global and national level. This disconnect between wealth and money is a serious problem, and it's not sustainable. And then lastly, markets. And I talk about in the book that we need to bring back business fundamentals to our exchanges. We've lost that to the technology, the high-density trading, and again, that's creating volatility that I think is ultimately very dangerous. So those are very real things we can do starting today.
As I hear you talking, I think about a model that says, what if we took every capable worker in America and put them to work without regard for what their salary was, and determined a cost of living that says, okay, they take a job and it's $10 an hour, but they really need $15 an hour to live. So we would subsidize in some way to get them to that point, but we would have no unemployment, we would have families working, dignity restored, and there would be a way to have them contribute by paying taxes on the $10. They would be feeding into a system that would help to subsidize others. Those in the higher earnings would not be penalized. It would be almost a flat tax, if you would, 1% across the board. I would be happy to do that if I knew that it was equitably being distributed and that would put more people to work and would be less people who are in an entitlement system. And I don't consider Social Security or Medicare entitlement because I paid 48 years every month.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, 48 years into a system, and then they tell me it's an entitlement. Wait a second. You had a fiduciary responsibility to invest that and provide me with a return. I could have gone to E.F. Hutton or whoever else with that same money. That's not a government gift. That's my money. You took that out of my paycheck. But if we had a system that was a hybrid, that said we're going to collectively raise this, and we found a way to use capitalism, free market economy, but a way to get more people either the training that they need in order to get into the workforce, the motivation to get out from really eliminate the system that even allows you not to work, because that's not a biblical value. A person who doesn't work doesn't eat, according to what the Bible says. But we have created these systems over a period of time due to economic crisis, due to, I think it's an illiteracy or a literacy problem is at the very heart of it all, and that people who can't read can't work, and that people who can't read raise children that can't read. And so the highest percentage of people in our social systems, in our youth offender programs, in our food stamp programs, are those people whose literacy rate is lower than what is to be the acceptable level for gainful employment. So we know that there's some root causes, but we only address the symptoms, not the causes. Would that be something that would be reflective of capitalism, or would that be reflective of socialism, or would that be a pure hybrid approach that took into impact this liberty-based kind of economy that raised the level and made it so that I felt better about my tax dollars being used not for government programs, but to get everybody to work that can work, and thereby generating more GDP by getting us out of our debt as a nation, increasing our productivity, and restoring the pride and the dignity of people who are impoverished because it's circumstantial.
Mm-hmm. Well, I won't get into the details of the technical solution you recommended, because that's an interesting possibility. But I would affirm wholeheartedly this notion of a living wage, which you alluded to. You know, Adam Smith, who those of us who, tend to be traditional economic liberals, as we're called. One of the great ironies with terminology is vocabulary changes. Political conservatives are economic liberals, as I'm sure you know, because it refers to the economic liberalism of free markets from the 18th century. They point to Adam Smith very often as sort of the godfather of market-based capitalism. Many of them would be surprised to find out that he was actually a huge proponent of the living wage. Why? Because if you ask someone to work full-time for a wage that isn't sufficient for subsistence, they are not actually fully participating in the economy, so you're strangling your own future customer base. Whereas if everyone has a wage which is slightly higher than what's required for subsistence, you build your own future markets. And interestingly enough, he pointed to the capitalism of America as an example of that, as opposed to the capitalism of the UK in the 19th century, which he saw as quite predatory in the way it treated employees. So I think that is absolutely the kind of thing we need to look at. Now, how we get there is complex. What you described to me is a very pragmatic solution. And I am an economic pragmatist. When people say, Ken, are you a capitalist? Are you a socialist? What are you? I say, I'm an economic pragmatist. I believe in the markets because I've seen what they can do. But we have problems that need solutions that may look something slightly different than a kind of pure capitalism or a pure socialism. Let's help the people that need to get into the system because it's ultimately in everyone's best interest to have everybody in the system. Now, you might be interested to know that in the UK, what they have done recently, which is, I thought, quite clever, they decided that the government wouldn't get involved in terms of subsidizing a living wage. But what they did was they gave plenty of time for the private sector to prepare for the payment of a living wage. And they said, instead of saying with immediate effect, £15 an hour, they said over the next 7 years, we're going to evolve to that. And we're going to make exceptions for those areas of the economy where it makes no economic sense. So it doesn't make sense for a 19-year-old person to get a living wage when their contribution to the economy isn't supportive of that and isn't necessary because they aren't in a subsistence environment. So there are intelligent ways to get us to a more inclusive capitalism, but the thing is we need to do it. And part of it means that companies and shareholders need to accept their responsibility. Some folks just wrote a book called Completing Capitalism, in which they looked at the Mars Corporation, who came up with what they call their mutuality program. What they did is they said, instead of saying we are going to absolutely, in absolute terms, maximize our profits, let's establish what is a more than reasonable profit, and then anything in excess of that, we will reinvest in the business, but we're going to reinvest it in our supply chain to ensure that the cocoa farmer and the small distributor and everybody in the entire supply chain is not only surviving, they are thriving. And it has been a brilliant success. So we can have virtuous capitalism without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without taking over the private sector, without intruding on markets, but it means everybody's got to agree that this is important for all of us to do. And that's the key. The motive is, this is the right thing to do. It's the biblical thing to do. It's the godly thing to do. It's the virtuous thing to do.
In the world at large, where Christianity is not the majority of the world, it is an impactful area, but then you have to divide Christianity into Catholicism and then other, which further erodes the percentage, which actually puts Islam in a universally accepted, applied theology or ideology at the top line because it's fairly uniformly applied. There's one way to do it, and it's their way. We're faced globally with a number of challenges based on societal and ideological principles. But in the Americas and in the EU, or the former, what was formerly known as the EU,
the EU still exists.
The EU still exists. Can these changes be made, and can capitalism be redeemed? And what can you and I do other than continue to bring this message? What can we do in our own communities? What can we be saying to our own politicians? And how can we frame it for them? And what resources do you even make available that might help us do that?
Well, that's a great question. And as I said before, this is a process, not an event. Redemption is a process, not an event. It's part of a long-term healing, healing from the effects of sin. So there is no magic bullet, there is no instant magic wand we can wave, but We are already doing it right now by having this conversation.
Yes.
We are already doing it by highlighting companies like Mars, who are already doing it. The other thing which is very encouraging is, I spent about 10 years as a chaplain at Oxford University dealing with the next generation of leaders coming up. And you know what? They are on board with this. They want to be capitalist, but they want to be a different kind of capitalist, maybe from our generation. They want to see virtuous capitalism. So this is one of the best opportunities the church has to be relevant, if you will, by having a seat at the table, by saying we have much to offer here, and then by setting good examples in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own businesses. Let me say one other thing, if I may. I happen to have on my desk here, I didn't intend to talk about it. This is a book called The Routledge Companion to Business Ethics. It's a secular publication. I was asked to write the chapter on religious belief and business ethics. And I can tell you, there is nothing in Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Hinduism that runs contrary to these values and these virtues that we've spoken of. Every one of those traditions have elements in them which will resonate with what we're talking about. And that's because these virtues are universal. Faith, hope, and love are universal. It has to do with being created in the image of God. So we have a great platform. In the book, I talk about common grace. I talk about wisdom. I talk about all of these wonderful tools that are in our toolkit that we can start employing now. And it's going to take time, but I'm an optimist at the end of the day because I believe God's in control.
Amen. Amen. Dr. Kenneth Barnes, author of Redeeming Capitalism. Thank you for sharing biblical insights, economic insights, practical insights, and a way that we can impact social, economic, and biblical change into our economy without sacrificing wealth, without sacrificing our ability to earn, but also to make ourselves more relevant and truly more in compliance with the Word of God if
Amen.
we just apply these principles. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. God bless you, my friend.
God bless you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.